Hi, everyone. Welcome to Coping with COVID. It is so great to have all of you here. Today is Monday, August 3rd, and we are returning from a 2-week hiatus. I'm very, very happy to be seeing so many of you again. Thank you for being here. There are a couple things just to hit on this week before we dive into some additional questions. And by all means, if you have additional questions, put them into the chat because there are only a couple of things to talk about this week. So we will definitely make sure to answer any questions that come in real time. The first thing I wanted to touch on is the status of the pending legislation that may extend aspects of the CARES Act. Currently, the Senate has passed a version of their bill and the House has passed a version of their bill, and there is a big difference between those two bills. So they will currently be reconciled, and then assuming some sort of reconciliation happens, then they will go to the president's desk to be signed into law. But where we stand right now is a couple of big things. Both bills include an additional stimulus payment. That's that $1,200 amount that came out through the IRS earlier this year. Feels like it was a couple of weeks ago, but it was probably closer to a couple of months ago. Both bills include an additional stimulus payment of $1,200. The difference in these bills tends to be in the $500 for dependent children and who counts as a dependent child, right? So watch for that to be sorted out. But if this legislation does move forward, it will likely include an additional stimulus payment that will come out from the IRS and probably be direct deposited into the place where you got your last stimulus check, which is kind of nice. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's a big difference is the extra $600 a week that's coming out to supplement the regular unemployment payments that people are getting through their states. In the Senate version of the bill, the additional amount will be $200 through the end of October, I think, and then it will scale down to be a percentage of what you would be eligible for under normal times. And under the House bill, the additional $600 per week continues through the end of the year. So that is a pretty big difference between the two bills. So this is something we'll all be watching closely to see when and if it gets resolved and what that will look like. So I would caution you, if you are continuing to receive unemployment benefits, you will see those benefits go way down right now until new legislation is passed. If new legislation is passed. So it will revert to your regular unemployment benefit through the state without that extra $600 amount. So for many people, that can be quite a bit of a shock. So if you are someone who was living on that lower amount and saving the additional amount, I'd encourage you to keep living on the lower amount since that's what's going to be coming in. But of course, we know that is very challenging for many people to do. So continue to stay tuned on that. Many of you may have also needed to reapply for unemployment since if the original 13 weeks of unemployment was fully extended, you may have had to reapply in your state, which is very, very frustrating. And I know how frustrating that has been for many of you. So that's the second kind of major difference between the two bills. The first was the stimulus, which is not a huge difference. The second is the amount of additional unemployment support. The third major difference is how much support is going to be going to the state and local governments through the federal government. The House bill has quite a lot of support going to our states. I read an article this morning that said revenues collected by the states are down about 23% right now, which means everything the states fund, which is a lot if you look around, is being curtailed. And that's putting a lot of pressure on the states. So the House bill wants to provide some federal support to help prop up some of those state budgets. The Senate bill has virtually no support going to the states. So those tend to be the three biggest differences between the two bills. The other things we're paying attention to is the August recess for the Senate that is on the horizon, and knowing all the political posturing that's going on. There is really no good way for me anyway to predict whether and if something might come together in support of individuals. But if it does, I promise you we will dig into the details and make sure everyone knows kind of what they need to do. And hopefully what they need to do is almost nothing, because since we've already been through this once with the CARES Act, hopefully the infrastructure at least exists to continue providing these benefits when and if they are extended. So the other question that came through this week, beyond just sort of what's going on with the legislation, was a question about forming an LLC. And this person happened to live in a place where forming an LLC was going to cost about $800. That's the fee they're required to pay to the state. In other states, it's considerably less expensive than that. I know in Ohio, it's $125. In many states, it's between $100 and $150. But in some states, including New York and New Jersey and California and a handful of others, it is more expensive, both in terms of an annual filing fee, and also in a state like New York, there's something we call a notice requirement. So once you form your LLC, which is fairly inexpensive, you have to pay between $1,000 and $1,500 to publicly advertise that your LLC exists. That's that notice requirement. So that's kind of annoying. Luckily, in New York, that's not an annual fee, that's just at the beginning. But this person was making the point that, okay, maybe it doesn't make sense for me to form an LLC right now at this point in the year. What can I do to protect myself instead? So I wanted to spend some time talking about different protection strategies if you are going to operate as a sole proprietor, because that's the way the majority of individual artists operate, which is pretty fantastic. So if you are going to operate as a sole proprietor, I would encourage you to think through a couple of things. The first thing is, do you need liability insurance? And this depends on the type of work you do. If you are a musician and you bring students into your home to give music lessons, yeah, you might want to have liability insurance to cover if the student trips on a rug or falls on your front steps or something like that. And it's worthwhile to look at your existing homeowners or renters insurance policy to see if it covers liability like that. If your current policy for your space, so homeowners insurance or renters insurance, is just for you personally, it may not cover business use of your home, which wouldn't necessarily cover the example I shared where a student is coming into the home for a music lesson, trips, breaks their leg, and sues you, right? Now, that's kind of an extreme example, so it would be up to you to say, okay, what is the likeliness of this happening? And is it worthwhile for me to purchase an additional liability insurance policy for my space? Things you would want to kind of look at to see if that makes sense. I would say, number one, what does that policy cost? I would start by asking for a quote from your current insurance provider, either for homeowners or renters insurance, or maybe your car insurance if you have something like that. That's where I would start. I would get a quote from them and maybe one or two other insurance companies just to kind of see what the fee for that might be. And if the fee is relatively low, it's probably not a bad idea to go ahead and have if you have others coming into your space pretty regularly. If you never have other people coming into your space, you might decide that it's not necessarily worth it for you to explore a liability insurance policy like that. Now, what if you do a totally different type of work? Maybe you do installation artwork, or maybe you're a videographer or a photographer or a producer, so you're out on different locations, but you're the one kind of financing or initiating these sites as opposed to doing them for someone else. You can look at a short-term insurance policy that will cover the project in the space you're going to be doing it. Fractured Atlas used to be my favorite company for these short-term policies. Now you have to be a member of Fractured Atlas before you can get insurance information from them. So if that makes sense for you, definitely think about it. Otherwise, you can look at some short-term project insurance policies through your current insurance company or through groups you might be a member of. If you're a member of an art league or a writers guild or a producers guild or a freelancers union or something like that, often they will have connections to some sort of insurance company that will write these short-term project policies. I will say though, if you are dealing with a very traditional insurance company and you call them up and describe a public art piece you want to do and say you want insurance on it, they might have no idea what to do with you. And that's why the loss of something like Fractured Atlas is keenly felt. Excuse me, I'm going to take a quick sip of water. So those are the first two things I would think about. Insurance for your space at home and insurance for your space out in the world if you are out in the world kind of doing things regularly that might carry some liability risk to them, especially if other humans are going to be involved. The third type of protection that sometimes comes up is protection for your stuff. So let's pretend your computer or your iPad or a Cintiq or an instrument or something else is absolutely vital to your creative practice. You may want to think about having an insurance policy on that particular asset. And again, where I would start is with your homeowners or renters insurance policy, because that probably covers items within your home or your dwelling space, but there is probably a per item financial limit. Sometimes it's as low as $2,000. And there's also probably some sort of overall financial limit to replace all of the contents of your home or your dwelling space. So as you kind of look into the details of your own policy, it might be interesting for you to say, okay, would this cover my super fancy camera if it got destroyed, or my tablet or my computer? And if the answer is no, then you might want to look at adding what we call a rider to your insurance policy, which is sort of a policy on top of a policy that says, okay, this will cover all of my regular stuff, and this rider will cover my super fancy trumpet that is worth way more than the rest of the contents of my home, or something like that. And that rider will be priced separately, and then you can pay for that rider. So that's kind of where I would start in thinking through protection strategies. And honestly, they're good strategies to have regardless of your entity type. But if you are definitely going to be a sole proprietor, those are the first three things I would think about. Because under all of those circumstances, you are essentially transferring some of your risk to someone else, an insurance company, in exchange for a fee, which is not a bad strategy at all, especially if the fee is something reasonable for the protection you're getting. The other option would be to think about ways of reducing your risk, right? So classic example of this would be having a fire extinguisher or a smoke detector. Both of those things reduce the risk of something going wrong without transferring that risk completely to someone else. So what would that look like in the arts? Definitely fire extinguisher and smoke detector for your space. But it could also look like digital copies of your work, storage space where you're backing up things in case it gets lost. It could be contracts you have with anyone you're doing creative business with to make sure everybody sort of understands the limitations. And it could also be language you pull from standard contracts through the freelancers union or any of the other guilds that exist that describe how you cannot be held liable for certain things. And depending on your creative practice, those certain things can vary, but having some language like that in a contract is not perfectly foolproof, but it's not a terrible idea. So there are some things you can do to transfer the risk to other people, usually through insurance. And there are also some things you can do to reduce your risk in the first place, like taking reasonable safety precautions, and then also having language to make sure everybody's on the same page and things are generally well understood. There's a question in the chat. What if someone is shooting remotely and they're having the subjects shoot themselves in foreign countries with their own phones? That's a great question. I would say it probably depends on what you think your personal risk is. Depending on the country, you may, let's say you're asking someone to film themselves saying something controversial about a government that is not particularly open to that. So maybe that person is facing personal liability risk, and maybe if they send it to you, you would be exposing yourself to personal liability risk. I don't know that you could make that go away through a contract, but that might be just something that you're sort of willing to bear. I think it is important that from an ethical perspective, the subjects that would be filming themselves would understand the risks they are undertaking, and you would want to make sure that you are not providing any sort of guarantees for their safety. If it's not that situation, if they are in a country where they are generally free to say whatever they want, but they might film themselves in a dangerous place, you know, falling off a boat or slipping down a mountain or something like that, you could probably add some language to a contract that says something to the effect of, please be safe and responsible. We are not responsible for any injuries you may face. So something like that. Okay, so it's not going to be them sort of filming themselves in precarious places, but rather just an interview situation. And in that case, I would have them agree to some language about the interview that says, you are going to own the contents of the interview, and you are able to use the contents in whatever way you want, within keeping of the sort of general outline of the project. And you will give them credit in any distribution of something. But you might want to also specify that they are not entitled to any financial profits or remuneration or anything like that as part of their agreement to participate. So something like that. If they're in a hospital doing surgery, then I think that would make sense to get the hospital to agree that you can use the footage. Especially internationally, there are different HIPAA style laws that apply in different jurisdictions. So you would want to make sure that you are complying with any of those. But from a liability perspective, right, let's pretend you show footage of someone undergoing surgery, and then they say, you shouldn't have done that, take it down. Then you take it down, right? You wouldn't necessarily continue to cause them harm. And it would be, I would think, saying this as a non-attorney, relatively hard for them to sue you or accuse you of, you know, intentionally hurting them in a way that you would have to then settle that liability. So I think what we're thinking about when it comes to kind of protecting yourself is, okay, what is the real risk, both from a financial perspective, a reputational perspective, and a personal perspective? And then how do we manage that risk reasonably? Is it through reducing the risk through contracts, informed consent, things like that? Or is it through some sort of insurance or standard liability protection thing? And then it just becomes a cost-benefit analysis. What's the cost of protecting yourself versus the benefit, right? So I think if we lived in a place where, you know, a state where it was very dry and very much like a desert and not at high risk of flooding, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to purchase flood insurance. But if we lived somewhere that was below sea level, prone to flooding, and, you know, at risk of hurricanes regularly coming through, flood insurance is probably a really good idea. So in all of these contexts, we're looking at what's the impact of the disastrous event and the likelihood that it will happen. And as both of those things increase, right, higher level impact and higher likelihood of happening, then we move closer and closer to a strategy that transfers the risk to someone else. And in all cases, we generally think about taking reasonable precautions to reduce our risk. And again, that can be an S corporation or an LLC, but it doesn't have to be. It can be any sort of other things as well. And by the way, that's sort of the same strategy we take when we're looking at investment options, right? We look at cost benefit, risk and reward, and all of that other stuff coming together. All right, other questions that have come in the chat? Oh, here's another one that came through. This one is about licensing. So let's say someone takes a picture and they own that picture and you want to use it. What does that look like? Essentially, you have two options. You can buy the picture outright from them. So you purchase the picture and you can do whatever you want with it, assuming you credit them, right? Or you can buy the right to use that picture in certain limited circumstances. So if you're going to buy the picture outright, that generally means that they cannot then sell it to someone else or use it in any other capacity, often including a personal capacity, although that's really hard to enforce. If you don't want to buy it outright, if you just want the right to use the image in a documentary or on your website or on social media, then you would approach them, offer them some sort of licensing fee for the right to use this image in a particular context for a particular amount of time. And if your advisors would tell you to describe that as broadly as possible, and their advisors would encourage them to make that as narrow as possible, right? And then you just kind of meet in the middle. So maybe you want the right to use the image in a creative work you are making, and then distribute that creative work in whatever medium it might make sense to distribute it through, whether that is online or, on a sort of printed capacity on a disc or sold for downloads or something like that. And maybe you also want the right to use the image in any promotional pieces you would have for the film or video, including on social media and on your website. And maybe you want this right forever and ever and ever. They might say, you know what, you can have that right for the next 18 months or so. And then you sort of negotiate and come to reasonable use that makes sense for you for a price point that also makes sense for you. What other questions do you have? The other thing I wanted to talk about was the GDP numbers that came out last Thursday. I don't know if you felt the panic of the economic world in the same way that economists did, but the numbers are pretty bad. And I don't have to tell you that. You probably knew they were going to be bad. If you look around the world, right, it feels like they would be kind of bad. When we look at them on an annualized basis, meaning for all of 2020, the numbers would suggest that our economy, our gross domestic product, is contracting by just under 33%, which is kind of a big deal. But again, if you look at the reduced numbers of people dining out and people consuming less, people purchasing fewer things, people traveling less, all of these things are sort of snowballing into a contracted economy, which is not unsurprising, but it's still kind of hard to see those numbers for sure. So, the numbers aren't good. What does bring me a little bit of comfort is the same study came out and showed that the savings rate of individuals is going up. It's higher than it was at this point last year, which means people are saving money instead of spending it, which for someone like me is a really good defensive strategy, but I am also keenly aware that not everyone is able to save money, right? And many people are just barely scraping by. So a macro trend of people saving money doesn't necessarily align with what we are all feeling, right? Having said that, there are still things going on. Schools are still opening. Those of you who teach or who are adjunct instructors may continue to have income from these sources. And other parts of the economy are starting to open up a little bit, although, it will probably be quite some time before our performers are back performing at full capacity and our creative individuals are writing at full capacity and producing at full capacity. A question in the chat about any PPP updates. The short answer is no. There is chatter between the two bills about increasing additional funding for some of those PPP loans. But the problem is the first tranche of funding wasn't fully expended by the deadline, even with the extended deadline, which has a couple problems with it. So number one, I think there was still some confusion about whether people were eligible for it. I think the largest groups that were eligible and the people who were really on top of it applied for it, got it, they're totally fine. So I think there was still some questions of eligibility. So I think there are small businesses that could have had access that didn't receive the PPP funding. I think the second issue is the PPP funding still appears to be capped at that 8-week number for, 8 weeks of your Schedule C line 31 or 2 months of your Schedule C line 31, right? So I think what could be interesting is if, for example, we said, okay, the pandemic lasted longer than we thought it would way back in March. So now let's extend that to be maybe 4 months of Schedule C line 31. I think that could be helpful for individuals, and anyone who had gotten PPP would then be eligible for more PPP. But that's not currently what's being discussed. What's being discussed is, do we continue the program for longer, when in reality, most companies, individuals, creative entrepreneurs who have gotten funding need more funding. And as it's written, they're not eligible for that yet. So I would say continue to stay tuned, but it feels like the new bills are prioritizing additional stimulus money and figuring out the nuances of unemployment rather than prioritizing additional PPP funding at this moment. Another question in the chat, have I heard of anyone getting their PPP fully forgiven yet? And if so, how long has the process taken? No, I have not. In fact, the two financial institutions I'm most familiar with still have not opened their PPP forgiveness portal yet. So if anyone has successfully applied for forgiveness, definitely put that in the chat so that we can kind of monitor that. But as far as I can tell, the major financial institutions have not necessarily opened up applications for forgiveness yet, and I have not heard of anyone successfully receiving forgiveness yet, although I know of several organizations that are ready to go as soon as those applications open up again, and I know of several individuals who have fully spent all of their money already. My guess is that the process will take about as long as it took for you to get the money in the first place. So if you think about the initial day you applied, and then however long it took you to get an SBA number and the closing documents from your bank, which was probably maybe a couple of weeks, depending on where you were in the process, and then maybe another week or two after that to actually get the funds. My guess is the forgiveness process will take about that long. So I would count on a couple of weeks at the absolute minimum. No one has chatted me about receiving forgiveness yet. So my guess is we haven't gotten there yet. What other questions do you have? I see in the chat someone shared that the Financial Times did a great piece on how travel is hurting economies globally. I am certain that is true. The lack of travel probably is really painful. And with the travel restrictions that US citizens are facing, that's probably additionally hurting lots of countries around the world. And I imagine it's also hurting our economy because if I were living somewhere else in the world right now, I don't know that I would travel to the United States. So it is definitely, it's kind of a mess, and will continue to be a mess. What I wrote about in the newsletter that may have gotten to some of you today, I think many of you are subscribed to the newsletter, but some have not. What I wrote about today in the August newsletter is giving yourself permission to not do anything financially this month. Normally, I would be telling you to update your budgets and let's think about some year-end planning, like for your IRAs or your SEP plans or contributions to charity. So I am giving you full permission to not do anything in August when it comes to your finances. Because you've done a lot this year already. We have rebudgeted thousands and thousands of times and managed cash flow in lots of different ways and figured out PPP and EIDL and all the nonsensical unemployment hurdles that you've been through. So I give you permission to just exhale a little bit this month and not feel pressure to do anything. But if you have some time or feel like you maybe want to do something, I might suggest that you do a little financial journaling. This is one of my favorite things to encourage clients to do. And in the newsletter, I included 3 prompts. The first one was, I'm wondering about ... So if there are financial questions that are sort of lingering in your brain about things you're wondering about, maybe just start journaling about them. The examples I gave in the newsletter are some common questions I hear. So the difference between a money market account and a mutual fund, sometimes that trips people up. Or I'm wondering if I should save for retirement, or is it too late? Or I'm wondering what the best way to reach my customers and clients are now. Any of those sort of financial wonderings could be interesting things to explore this month. The next prompt is something I admire about people who have their financial lives together is ... So this idea of thinking about habits that people that you admire have when it comes to their money and kind of exploring what those might look like for you. So the idea of, you know, I really admire people who have healthy financial conversations with their partners, right? And then, you know, thinking about a little bit more about what that might look like. Or I really admire people who know their credit score, or I really admire people who do something called rebalancing their portfolio, because I can't even spell that, let alone know what that means. So thinking about sort of the action-driven steps, and maybe they're aligned with the things you're wondering about, or maybe they're totally different. But exploring what some of those are through the lens of someone I admire does this and I'd like to learn more about it kind of lens, that can be a helpful starting journal prompt. And then the third one relates to control. Things that you feel like you can and cannot control financially, and how are you feeling about those. And those of you who have worked with me closely know that these are not surprising, because when I work one-on-one with individuals, we are always talking about knowledge gaps. So things, the difference between what you want to know and what you currently know. Action gaps, the bridge between what you currently do and what you maybe want to do, and ways of maybe supporting those habit changes. And then intention gaps, sorting through the things that you cannot control and the things you can, and figuring out the difference between those two things. So these journal prompts, something about what you're wondering, something about actions that you might have thought about or might admire, and then thinking about things you can and cannot control, are meant for you to just start kind of exploring some of those things with no pressure to do anything related to those words at all. And that's okay, because remember, I give you permission to do nothing this month except relax and take care of yourself as we go into what will probably be a continually tough fall. So thinking about some of those things, and then when the time is right, going back and revisiting some of those journalings, just to maybe tease out a couple of things that you might want to work on, that could be an interesting next step. Other questions in the chat. Oh, someone said, I mentioned pricing. What is that? So I finished a workshop today. There's something going on called the Millennial Summit, and it's a 3-day all online gathering of individuals talking about various things. And so my workshop was on pricing strategies. So we talk about the way I present pricing is the 4 things that inform the price for your work or your time, which are your costs, your customers, what are they willing and able to pay, your competitors, what are they charging and how are you similar and different from them? And then lastly, your competencies, what makes you the most special, capable person of doing the work you do. And so those 4 factors influence the price for your work or time. So thinking about them holistically and then bringing them together into a pricing strategy is one of my favorite things to do, actually. But I have a lot of favorite things to do, as you know. So maybe one of these weeks, if there's interest, we'll talk more about pricing strategies. Other questions? I think we covered the PPP updates, no PPP updates. We covered sort of the highlights of some of the differences. Let's see, what else? Oh, we covered protection strategies. If you are remaining a sole proprietor and what that would look like. A couple people putting in the chat that they are bad at pricing and they would love to talk more about pricing. That sounds like a really good plan for next week. I will put it on the calendar. The questions have definitely slowed down. So definitely pricing strategy is a great thing to talk about next week. And 2 people just mentioned that they are bad at pricing. It's totally fine. It's icky and awful for everyone. So you're not bad at it. You just need some different vocabulary, perhaps. I will also share as well the Center for Cultural Integration based in California has some business of art programming that they are opening up. They also announced additional micro grants. I think they're $1,000 grants that are available to help artists in need. That's cci.org, I'm pretty sure is their website. They publish that great business of art book that comes out every 4 or 5 years or so. And they do really wonderful work. They are giving priority for artists in need that are based in California, but it is national, so anyone can apply. And then Indiana Arts Commission, I think, has opened a new round of grants, so that might be worth checking into. And then I think the Ohio Arts Council announced additional grants this week as well, which could be helpful. So stay tuned. There are definitely organizations and individuals really working hard to help and support. And as we know, a micro grant is helpful, but may not make enough of a difference right now. As things continue in confusing ways. But I have enjoyed spending this time with you today. I hope you feel slightly less confused, and I will look forward to seeing you next Monday, August 10th, and per request from those of you in the chat, we will definitely cover some pricing strategies next week. So thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your week, and if you have additional questions, definitely send them to me via email and we'll make sure that we cover them in a future week. Have a great one, everyone. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon.